Okay, how's it going, everybody? This is Marxist Saw. Today we're going to read some V.I. Lenin. This was written in April 1918. This is called Left-Wing Childishness. It's got several different parts here we will read. And so this is not to be confused with left-wing communism and infantile disorder. This is just a little five-part pamphlet that is not the book Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, which would come out maybe 2 years later. But this is 1920. So this is Left Wing Childishness by V.I. Lenin, written in 1918. Let's go ahead and get into this. There's 5 different parts here. This got a very quick intro. See, the publication by a small group of, quote, left communists, end quote, in their journal Communists, number 1, April 20th, 1918, and of their, quote, Thesis, end quote, strikingly confirms my views expressed in the pamphlet, The Immediate Task of the Soviet Government. There could not be better confirmation in political literature of the other naivete of the defense of petty bourgeois sloppiness that is sometimes concealed by, quote, left slogans. It is useful and necessary to deal with the arguments of, quote, left communists, end quote, because they are characteristic of the period we are passing through. They show up with exceptional clarity the negative side of the, quote, core of this period. They are instructive because the people we are dealing with are the best of those who have failed to understand the present period. People who by their knowledge and loyalty stand far above the ordinary representatives of the same mistaken views, namely, the left socialist revolutionaries. So let's go ahead and get into this. This is number 1, the first section. As a political magnitude, or as a group claiming to play a political role, the, quote, left communist, quote, group, end quote, group has presented its, quote, thesis on the present situation, end quote. It is a good Marxist custom to give a coherent and complete exposition of the principles underlying one's views and tactics. And this good Marxist custom has helped to reveal the mistake committed by our, quote, lefts, because the mere attempt to argue and not to declaim exposes the unsoundness of their argument. The first thing that strikes one is the abundance of allusions, hints, and evasions with regard to the old question of whether it was right to conclude the Brest Treaty. The lefts dare not put the question in a straightforward manner. They flounder about in a comical fashion, pile argument on argument, fish for reasons, plead that, quote, on the one hand, end quote, it may be so, but, quote, on the other hand, end quote, it may not. Their thoughts wander over all the sundry subjects. They try all the time not to see that they are defeating themselves. The lefts are very careful to quote the figures: 12 votes at the party congress against peace, 28 votes in favor, but they discreetly refrain from mentioning that of the hundreds of votes cast at the meeting of the Bolshevik group of the Congress of Soviets, they obtained less than 1/10. They have invented a, quote, theory that the peace was carried by, quote, the exhausted and declassed elements, end quote, while it was opposed by, quote, the workers and peasants of the southern regions, where there was great vitality in economic life and the supply of bread was more assured, end quote. Can one do anything but laugh at this? There is not a word about voting at the All-Ukraine Congress of Soviets in favor of peace, nor about the social and class character of the typically petty bourgeois and declassed political conglomeration in Russia who were opposed to peace, the Left Socialist Revolutionary Party. In an utterly childish manner, by means of amusing, quote, scientific explanations, they try to conceal their own bankruptcy, to conceal the facts, the mere review of which would show that it was precisely the declassed intellectual cream of the party, the elite, who opposed the peace with slogans and couched it in revolutionary petty bourgeois phrases, that it was precisely the mass of workers and exploited peasants who carried the peace. Nevertheless, in spite of all above-mentioned declarations and evasions of the lefts on the question of war and peace, the plain and obvious truth manages to come to light. The authors of the theses are compelled to admit that, quote, the conclusion of peace has for the time being weakened the imperialists, end quote. Attempts to make a deal on a world scale, end quote. This is so imperialist. It's weaken the imperialist attempts to make a deal on a world scale, end quote. This is inaccurately formulated by the lefts, but this is not the place to deal with this inaccuracies. Quote, the conclusion of peace has already caused the conflict between the imperialist powers to become more acute, end quote. Now this is a fact. Here is something that has decisive significance. That is why those who oppose the conclusion of peace were unwittingly playthings in the hands of the imperialists and fell into the trap laid for them by the imperialists. For until the world socialist revolution breaks out, until it embraces several countries and is strong enough to overcome international imperialism, it is the direct duty of the socialists who have conquered in one country, especially a backward one, not to accept battle against the giants of imperialism. Their duty is to try to avoid battle, to wait until the conflicts between the imperialists weaken them even more, and bring the revolution in other countries even nearer. Our lefts did not understand this simple truth in January, February, and March. Even now they are afraid of admitting it openly, but it comes to light through all their confused reasoning, like, quote, on the one hand it must be confessed, and on the other hand one must admit, end quote. Quote, during the coming spring and the summer, end quote, the lefts write their thesis. Quote, the collapse of the imperialist system must begin in the event of a victory for German imperialism in the present phase of the war. This collapse can only be postponed, but it will then express itself in even more acute forms, end quote. This formulation is even more childishly inaccurate despite its playing at science. It is natural for children to, quote, understand science to mean something that can determine in what year, spring, summer, autumn, or winter the, quote, collapse must begin, end quote. These are ridiculous, vain attempts to ascertain what cannot be ascertained. No serious politician will ever say when this or that collapse of a system must begin. The more so that the collapse of the system has already begun, and it is now a question of the moment when the outbreak of revolution in particular countries will begin. But an indisputable truth forces its way through this childishly helpless formulation, namely, the outbreaks of revolution in other more advanced countries are near now. A month since the beginning of the respite which followed the conclusion of peace, than they were a month or 6 weeks ago. What follows? It follows that the peace supporters were absolutely right, and their stand has been justified by the course of events. They were right in having drummed into the minds of the lovers of ostentation that one must be able to calculate the balance of forces and not help the imperialists by making the battle against socialism easier for them when socialism is still weak, and when the chances of the battle are manifestly against socialism. Our, quote, left communists, however, who are fond of calling themselves proletarian communists because there is very little that is proletarian about them and very much that is petty bourgeois, are incapable of giving thought to the balance of forces to calculating it. This is the core of Marxism and Marxist tactics, but they disdainfully brush aside the core with proud phrases such as, quote, that the masses have become firmly imbued with an inactive peace mentality is an objective fact of the political situation, end quote. What a gem. After 3 years of the most agonizing and reactionary war, the people, thanks to Soviet power and its correct tactics, which never lapsed in the mere phrase-making, have obtained a very, very brief, insecure, and far from sufficient respite. The, quote, left intellectual striplings, however, with the magnificence of a self-infatuated Narcissus profoundly declare that the masses have become firmly imbued with an inactive peace mentality. So he puts here that the masses, question mark, and have become firmly imbued, exclamation, with an inactive, exclamation, question mark, peace mentality. That's how Lenin wrote it. Was I not right when I said at the party congress that the paper or journal of the lefts ought to have been called not communist, but Schlasik, Polish nobleman? Can a communist with the slightest understanding of the mentality and the conditions of life of the toiling and exploited people descend to the point of view of the typical declassed petty bourgeois intellectual with the mental outlook of a noble Schlasik, which declares that a peace mentality is inactive, and believes that the brandishing of a cardboard sword is activity? For our lefts merely brandish a cardboard sword when they ignore the universally known fact of which the war in Ukraine has served as an additional proof, that peoples utterly exhausted by 3 years of butchery cannot go on fighting without a respite, and that war, if it cannot be organized on a national scale, very often creates a mentality of disintegration peculiar to petty proprietors, instead of the iron discipline of the proletariat. Every page of communists shows that our lefts have no idea of iron proletarian discipline and how it is achieved, that they are thoroughly imbued with the mentality of the declassed petty bourgeois intellectual. Okay, yeah. So that is Left-Wing Childishness, the first section by V.I. Lenin. Next, we'll get into the second section. This was written in 1918. Well, thank y'all for tuning in. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Tumblr, Medium. All of these are Marxist Saw. Y'all hit me up there. Y'all have a great day. And